Hey folks, this week we are talking about ballistic and firearms evidence. Alright, so quick little definition of firearm is any device that fires a projectile or projectiles as a result of an explosive or propellant charge. Now, keep in mind, based on this definition, some of your airsoft and BB guns could fall into play. Every state kind of has their own little tweak on what a firearm is and isn't. So this is kind of a generic description of what a firearm is. Now, for our class, we're just going to be talking about what you would typically call a gun. And so the three types we would have are handguns, which come both as semi-automatics and revolvers, rifles, and shotguns. So handguns, you're looking at your semi-automatic gun. The revolvers, you're looking at a slightly different style of these weapons that can be held in one hand only. Rifles come in a lot of different varieties. Your standard hunting rifle, your old Western, lever action rifle, and then of course the ubiquitous assault rifle. Ooh, hey folks, guess what? There is no such thing as an assault rifle. That is a made-up term by the news media, and we're not going to get into that whole topic. I could spend probably 20 minutes just talking about it, but a rifle is a rifle is a rifle. And then your shotguns. Shotguns are a little bit different from a rifle, in that shotguns typically shoot out multiple projectiles, birdshot or BB, buckshot, a couple different terms out there depending on what your load is. Shotguns can send out a single projectile also in the form of a slug, but the little bit of time we have here to talk about firearms, can't get into all the little nuances of the differences between various kinds of shotguns. Now, the big thing to remember though is a shotgun typically is what we call a smooth-barreled weapon. Handguns and rifles will have a rifled barrel. As a matter of fact, that's where rifles get their original name from, having the rifled barrel. And the rifled barrel, those riflings, are raised and lowered portions, lands and grooves, and those lands and grooves are designed to grab onto the bullet and spin it as it travels down the barrel. The best way to understand why this is, think about football. When the quarterback throws a good pass and ends up getting that nice spiral on the ball, it's like a laser. It goes straight to where it needs to go. Versus when the quarterback kind of hastily throws it, just pitches it away, and doesn't get that good spiral on the ball, it tumbles. It could go anywhere based on windage and on a number of different topics. Now a rifle, or a shotgun, does not need rifling, because again, usually sending lots of projectiles down the barrel. So you're not looking at putting a spin on those projectiles. They're just going to go and spread out. That's what they were designed to do. Now, years ago, early firearms didn't have rifling. Our muzzle loaders didn't have rifling. When we started to try and get more accuracy, we added the rifling, and that's when we went from some of our muzzle loader ideas into rifles, or muskets. Because we did have rifles that were still muzzle loaded. Now the rifles and the barrels, we already kind of hit on this. We have our raised up portions and our lowered portions, the lands and the grooves. And so those impart spin onto the projectile and allow it to fly a more true and accurate path. When you take a look at rifling then on the bullet, what it imparts is impression evidence. And so here we can see the lands and the grooves, and we can even see some other imperfections that were imparted onto this bullet when it was fired, the striations. And one that has been fired, this here has been fired into a test chamber, so the bullet looks almost perfect. What we find at crime scenes usually looks like this, but look, you can still see some of these lands and grooves. You can still see quite a bit here. So the folks at the crime lab can take this bullet and still match it back to the gun, because the lands and the grooves will be identical to this bullet, except for you just have a smaller amount of visible ability on them. Some other impression evidence that is left behind, extractor, and ejector marks. So you have these little marks here, kind of hard to see in this photo sometimes on the computer screen, but you have a little mark here, a little divot that shows where the extractor grabbed onto the round and pulled it out of the magazine into the chamber ready to fire. You also have this little divot here, this little triangular shape ejector mark, so that when the round was fired, it popped out and allows the extractor to pull the next round into the chamber. You also notice this has a firing pin mark. We can show some additional firing pin marks. So again, some impression evidence. Different weapons have different styles of firing pins, And so these can be used to identify a gun. Not only the bullet, but the empty casings can help identify which gun that they came out of, the impression evidence stuff that we talked about, all those different, striations and scrapings and impressions that can be imparted by tools. It's essentially what most of firearms evidence is tool mark impression evidence. All right, so you find a crime scene, or you find a firearm at the crime scene. Don't touch it until it is time to touch it. You don't have to pick them up and unload them the second you get on scene. I always hear these officers, we have shown up at a couple suicide scenes, and the officers unloaded the firearm and hid it away somewhere. And it's like, why'd you unload the firearm? Well, it's a gun. It's dangerous. Hey, there's you and a dead guy on the scene, all right? There's not a lot of danger to the firearm. Maybe the family members are still on scene, but we get them out of the scene quickly. So what's the danger? Now it's you, me, and the firearm, and I'm your CSI. I'm not going to pick it up and shoot you. You probably aren't going to pick it up and shoot me. So where's the danger here? Let's keep the firearms in the place they're at until we photograph them. Never touch anything until it's photographed. When it is time to pick up the gun, don't stick a pencil down the barrel. They do that on TV all the time. Don't take your handkerchief that you blew your nose out of your pocket and wrap the gun in it. You're just going to rub off fingerprints. Pick it up in locations where people are less likely to touch the gun, say by like the trigger guard or way down low. Think about, unloading the firearm, even about where you can safely manipulate it without affecting fingerprints and potentially touch DNA these days, because we can get DNA out of our fingerprints off that weapon. When you start dealing with revolvers, we also need to make a little diagram of the revolver, indicating whether it's a left spin or right spin, and then also notating which position was in line with the barrel, and then also noting whether it was fired, unfired, loaded, or unloaded. So it becomes rather important, especially at suicide scenes, if you only have one or two chambers loaded, and were they loaded, and do we have one spent casing or two, especially when you have a suicide scene. Somebody usually can pull the trigger once, sometimes twice, but typically only once. Packaging of firearms, we put them in cardboard boxes, buy firearms boxes. We've got short boxes and long boxes for short guns and long guns. And the boxes you will see have little punch-out holes in the bottom. So we take zip ties and zip tie the firearm into the box so it doesn't slide around, doesn't shift around, where it's safe. Make sure the firearm is unloaded if possible before putting it into our firearms box. If you don't know how to unload a firearm, then you find somebody who does. If your agency doesn't have somebody who knows how to unload this firearm, contact the sheriff's department, contact somebody else, get somebody to unload this gun for you. If that is absolutely impossible, contact the crime lab. They should be able to help you. Unload, 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 unload at the time of collection. Photograph, photograph, photograph before you touch that gun. Use the boxes. Don't use the gun case, even if the gun's in a gun case. Don't be using their gun case. Don't be putting it in plastic. We're afraid of DNA these days and some potential of dampness on the firearm, and putting it inside of a plastic box can cause molding. Also, in the past, we used to talk about scribing. We used to actually take a little tool and scratch and etch logos and not logos, serial numbers and stuff onto firearms. Don't do that anymore. Stop doing that. And if you find an old textbook that talks about scribing and scratching on a firearm, ignore that one thing that book is telling you. All right, so range estimation, something else that's kind of interesting as it relates to documenting firearms scenes. When we get at autopsy, we can look at gunshot residue that is imparted on the victim of the shooting, and we can make some range estimations. Now, years ago, they used to make range estimations within a couple of different feet categories. These days, we basically call it contact, close shot, and far shots. Sometimes we can have some people talk about intermediate. So what essentially happens is unburnt residue comes out of the barrel of the firearm and imparts itself onto the person who's been shot or their clothing, and sometimes we refer to this as tattooing. Now, when a gun is directly up against somebody, the contact shot, you're actually going to get some burning and you're going to get some grease right there on the wound, if not into the wound. So we can usually tell contact or very close contact, nearly contact shots, versus as you come back a little bit further, now you end up getting situations where you have the powder coming out of the barrel, and just how much powder is deposited there and how thickly it's deposited there. You can start to give us some information about whether or not we're talking tight up against, very close, very far away, or undeterminable distance because it's so far away. So looking at this, what we end up with here is, contact, everything is pretty tight in. Near contact, this was measured, so this shot was done from 6 inches. 12 inches back, it's starting to get very hard to see, and by 18 inches, it's almost impossible to see. So, you're looking at some pretty close distances here. All right, one last thing we like to talk about is GSR, gunshot residue. So when somebody's firing a gun, look at here, you've got some of the residue coming out, some of the smoke, and so this deposits on this person's hand. And so what we can do is swab the hand. There's a couple different test systems out there. There's a new electronic one that's very nice. Where you swab the hand and you basically run a couple chemicals on the swab, and if it turns the right color, you have a positive test for gunshot residue. The likelihood of somebody touching, having fired the firearm is pretty high. Now, some of the new tests where you basically run a little strip along the person's hand, you put the strip inside of a little box, push the button, and it takes a couple minutes, and if it comes back, the green light shows up, gunshot residue is positive, red light shows up, not positive. A couple different tests out there, a couple different systems for running these tests. But what you're doing is showing the likelihood that somebody has handled a firearm, if not actually fired a firearm recently. And these tests are usually good for a couple days. You can also utilize alternate light sources and visualize somebody's hand. And if you see the little speckles, that is a good indicator that you have gunshot residue here. That would give you a good reason to swab their hands. All right, so just a short little lecture about firearms and ballistics. Again, most of this really goes back to the idea of impression evidence and tool marks, because that's really what a firearm is. It's just a big tool. So, it's just imparting the same tool marks as pry bars and other tools as it relates to impressions on the bullet, impressions on the casing. So that's what we got for this week. Any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, give me a phone call, stop out to the Public Safety Training Center and see me. Otherwise, I will talk to you next week.